Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Melissa Mueller, and I am DWDC's Program Specialist. And today I am joined by my colleagues, Kelsey Goforth and Amanda Coventry-Barrage. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that while we are meeting virtually, the land Dying with Dignity Canada is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we invite and encourage you to do your own research regarding the various treaties, in particular the land in which you are meeting us on today. And so we are so thrilled to welcome you today to our final webinar for 2022. Before I welcome today's presenters, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Everyone on the call today is muted. However, there will be opportunity to submit questions. So to do so, please type your questions in the question bar on the Zoom side panel, and we will read it out for you at the end. And please try to keep your questions as concise and clear as possible. And while we try to get to as many questions as we can, unfortunately, we may not get to everyone. And so if you have any outstanding questions following the webinar, or if you have questions that are quite personal in nature, please contact us at support@dyingwithdignity.ca, and we will follow up with you individually. And we will also be sending a post-webinar survey that will pop up on your screen after the webinar, and it will give you the opportunity to share your feedback. And this session is also being recorded, so you will be able to watch it again later, so there's no need to take notes if you don't want to. And I'm now happy to introduce today's presenters. First, we have Dr. Gord Gubitz. Dr. Gubitz became involved with medical assistance in dying shortly after federal legislation was passed that legalized MAID in Canada in 2016. He is the clinical lead for the MAID program in Nova Scotia and does assessments and provisions for eligible Nova Scotians. We also have Helen Long joining us today. Helen Long is the CEO of Dying with Dignity Canada, and since joining DWDC in early 2020, Helen has led the end-of-life right movement through Bill C7 and the subsequent work of the Special Joint Committee, advocating on behalf of people across Canada and educating elected officials, stakeholders, and supporters on the most pressing issues related to end of life today. So welcome both Helen and Dr. Gubitz for joining us today. So first I'm going to pass it over to Helen to begin her presentation, and then from there pass it over to Dr. Gubitz to begin his. So over to you, Helen.
Thanks, Melissa. Hopefully you can all see my screen now.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Sorry, I'm just moving boxes here. It's a bit of work. Okay, so good afternoon, and thanks everyone for joining us today. More importantly, I want to thank everyone here for their commitment over the past year. Whether you're a volunteer or a donor, a supporter, or an advocate, the contributions that you make and the stories that you share with us, they support us and sustain us as we do the work we do. Between the delays in the parliamentary review and more recent media, the lingering effects of COVID and the growing economic challenges, 2022 was a tough year, and your support has made the difference. So I, for one, am really looking forward to 2023. So in today's webinar, we've chosen to focus pretty specifically on medical assistance in dying, or MAID, and the road ahead for 2023. At the same time, our board of directors recently met to develop a multi-year strategic plan with 4 strategic goals. So while we're going to talk mostly about MAID today, I do want to touch really briefly on our other priorities. And I want you to know that the work that I talk about in terms of MAID is work that we also do in other areas of end of life. So our first strategic goal is to address the barriers to a good death through advocacy. Very specifically, our 2 most important concerns today related to MAID are advanced requests and an end to what we call forced transfers. When we talk about MAID and advocacy in 2023, we're really talking about the conclusion of the parliamentary review and hopefully the new legislation that will follow. Mandated in both C14 and C7, the parliamentary review required a special joint committee of parliament, that's members of the House of Commons and members of the Senate, to come together and review 5 core issues: advanced requests made for mature minors and those with a mental illness as a sole underlying condition, the state of palliative care, and the protection of Canadians living with disabilities. After a brief start in May of 2021 and then delays after that, including a federal election, the committee was finally reestablished and began meeting in April of 2022. Since then, they've met 30 times, heard from at least 151 witnesses, received 358 submissions, reviewed many reports and studies, and received tens of thousands of communications from stakeholders. During the course of the review and the process preceding that, 57,000 supporters like you wrote to their MPs. So thank you for those contributions. With the deadlines for their work delayed multiple times, the committee did finally issue an interim report that was specifically focused on MAID and mental disorders as a sole underlying condition in June. We're now waiting for the release of their final report, which is currently scheduled for February 17th of 2023. And what those numbers and activities don't tell you about is the number of calls, meetings, and other communications behind the scenes to try and influence this work. It's been a long and grueling process, and I think we're pretty happy to see that we're nearing the end. So in terms of MAID for those living solely with a mental disorder, the government established an expert panel. That panel released a final report in May that detailed 19 recommendations. They recognize that no system of safeguards, protocols, and guidance will satisfy everyone, but ultimately they found that the existing MAID eligibility criteria and safeguards, as well as the existing laws, the standards, and the healthcare practices, can provide an adequate structure for MAID in the case of mental disorders. So work is currently underway to develop practice standards and guidelines, and we're going to hear more from Gord on that a little later on. We know that what's most important to the majority of you and to 83% of Canadians is the issue of advance requests. That's the ability, when competent, to make a written request for MAID that could be honored later after the capacity to make medical decisions is lost. So an advance request would describe in detail a future circumstance at which someone might like to get an assisted death. The interim report did not address advance requests, so we're really waiting on the final report in February. At the same time, also going on, Senator Wallin has introduced a bill to allow advance requests, which is currently at second reading. So it has quite a long way to go, but it is out there. And we also recently heard in the media that Quebec, whose Bill S38 related to advance requests died during the Quebec provincial election. There are plans to reintroduce that bill, although no timing has been given. So that's also a positive development. I know it seems like we've been advocating for advance requests for a long time, but I think it's really important to remember that Bill C14 passed in 2016. With Bill C7 in 2021, we saw some big changes, including the removal of the reasonably foreseeable eligibility criteria and Audred's amendment. So while it seems like a long time, 6 years in legislative changes is really not very long. That said, we're absolutely committed to continue to fight until advance requests are legal. But we do need your help. And the single most important thing that you can do continues to be to call or write to your own member of parliament and tell them why this is important to you personally. And you can do that by using our online tool. But what's even more effective is to actually call or to send an email directly, just telling your story. So please consider doing that when you have time. So one of the questions that comes up frequently when we're talking about advance requests is always that of MAID and dementia, including Alzheimer's. So I do want to remind you that some people with dementia can access MAID. They must have this discussion with their healthcare provider while they still have capacity. Audrey's amendment, or the waiver of final consent, does allow someone who has been assessed and approved for MAID to receive it on their chosen date, even if they no longer have capacity to consent at the time of the MAID procedure. And that's based on a signed and dated agreement between the MAID provider and the individual when the person's death is naturally foreseeable. And that waiver can only be used by the provider who signed it and refers to the date that was selected, not the individual's state of health. So while advance requests for MAID are not currently legal, some people do choose to include this in their personal directive or their advanced care plan. And that helps to demonstrate the enduring nature of their request and may be a support for requests for MAID in the future. So there's a couple of really great webinars from earlier this year and last year specific to MAID and dementia on our website that were recorded that you can also go back and have a look at if this is an area that's of interest to you. That is also an important reminder that everyone should be planning for their end of life. We have a great advanced care planning kit on our website, which you can use to document your wishes. And then even more importantly, talk to your loved ones, your friends, your family, your primary caregiver, so that everyone knows exactly what your plans are. So the second advocacy issue we'll be focusing on in 2023 is that of forced transfers. A forced transfer occurs when someone is denied access to MAID in the healthcare facility they are in and is forced to transfer, often a grueling, inhumane, painful transfer, away from their circle of care to another facility so that they can undergo the MAID procedure. Dying with Dignity Canada believes that every publicly funded healthcare facility should allow MAID on site. While we support the conscience rights of healthcare providers to opt out of MAID, we do not believe that facilities should be able to opt out. Because healthcare falls under the provincial government, as you all know, the legislation or regulation that allows forced transfers to occur is different in every province and territory. So this is going to be a long battle that we'll be fighting for a while in collaboration with both our local chapters and using a slightly different approach depending on the barrier in every situation. So finally, in many ways, the biggest challenge in 2022 was the media. And unfortunately, I think this could go on for some time yet. It's been pretty challenging to see the amount of misinformation and the rhetoric that is out there this year. I know that even some of our fiercest supporters have had some questions and concerns because of the stories that have been presented. So in 2023, we're really going to continue to expand our efforts to not only respond to negative media and to correct misinformation, but also to pitch more stories and share more information publicly. I think just increasing general awareness of MAID and the public's understanding of the MAID process will certainly help to combat some of those stories. We recently updated our myths and facts page to provide some more comprehensive responses. So if you have questions about anything you're seeing, information that you're not sure is accurate, please visit that page and check it out. We're also continuing to use personal stories in our blogs to tell the true stories of real people and how important the ability to apply for MAID is for them. And for those who are asking again, how can you help? If you see misinformation in the media or on social media, please consider speaking up. Send a letter to the editor, post a correction on Facebook, and share your story with us. If you have questions or you want to share that story, you can visit the Contact Us page of our website. And this is an area where we've seen some great results with chapters and volunteers sending letters in this year and getting published. So we're looking forward to more success in this space in 2023. So on the program front, we're going to continue to identify and fill gaps in information, programs, and services related to end-of-life choices, including MAID. In 2023, we'll just continue to expand in response to what we're hearing from people across the country. So as an example, we recently released a MAID assessment guide, which will be followed shortly by a What is MAID resource. We'll continue expanding the webinars that we're doing and also look to see more webinars and also local presentations by our chapters next year. And we're also going to keep producing videos. They've been a great way to communicate, and we're going to build on that in 2023. We also anticipate that the increase in inquiries around information and navigation support will continue. We've seen since 2023 almost triple the number of interactions coming to Kelsey and her team this year. So our third strategic goal is to nurture a more inclusive and diverse end-of-life movement. We will seek out, listen to, and integrate more perspectives into the work that we do and focus outreach efforts on reaching new and more diverse communities. I think it's really important that every Canadian, everyone across Canada, understands what MAID is, and it's important that the perspective of every Canadian is integrated into the work we do. So in 2023, we will strive to be inclusive, equitable, and diverse, and to make our organization more reflective of Canadian society and also DWDC's values. And then finally, this one's for all of us. Dying with Dignity Canada will invest in the growth and development of the organization and its people so that we can leverage opportunities and mitigate risks for sustainability, create long-term enduring value, and be recognized as an employer of choice and a preferred charity. You're only as good as your people, and we have some great people, our staff, our board, volunteers, and supporters. So I want to thank each of you again for everything you do and your support over the past year. So hopefully that gave you a bit of a picture of our MAID focus for 2023. I'm going to turn it over to Gord now, who's going to talk a little more about what's coming on the clinical side in the year ahead.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Helen, and thanks as well to Dying with Dignity Canada for asking me to speak to you all today. I'm going to share my screen, so there'll be a small technological moment, and hopefully you will now be able to see my slides.
Yes, I can.
Wonderful. So my name is Gord Gubitz. I'm a neurologist by day in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and I'm going to speak to you today a little bit about a project called the Canadian MAID Curriculum Development Project. It's a mouthful. And a little bit about how we're going to be using that to try and provide better education for clinicians who are interested in becoming involved in MAID care across the country. In terms of conflicts of interest, as was mentioned in the intro, I've been an assessor and provider since 2016, and I get remunerated a small amount through fee-for-service billing for that. I'm the clinical lead for the Nova Scotia MAID Access and Resource Team, and I spend Friday mornings dealing with administrative stuff related to MAID in my province. And pertinent to this presentation, I'm chairing the project that's looking at developing these educational modules across the country, and I get a little stipend through that through a Health Canada grant. So important to know what your conflicts are when you're listening to somebody. I've got some objectives. So by the end of this session, hopefully I'll have been able to explain a little bit about a brief history of MAID education in Canada, appreciate the work that's being done to create a standardized MAID in Canada training curriculum, and be motivated hopefully to become involved in the rollout and early evaluation. So if there are any clinicians on the call today, we'd be looking for your assistance going forward. And there'll be time at the end of the session to address any questions that you might have. So in terms of medical assistance in dying itself, it's an interesting part of healthcare because it came into practice after a change in federal legislation derived from case law, rather through changes in healthcare. So it's an unusual sort of place to start because everything that we do as MAID clinicians falls under the criminal code as opposed to under good medical practice or standards of care in that way. As a result, clinicians who initially came forward to support patients requesting MAID did so without the benefit of MAID-related education and training. And this was one of those Homer Simpson moments because back in 2016, when it all came to fruition and the law changed, in many parts of the many parts of provinces, there was a bit of catch up that needed to happen in terms of figuring out, well, how do we actually go about making this happen for patients and also for their families who are interested in learning more about MAID or actually having a MAID provision for themselves. So as is the tradition in medical education, we adopted the classic see one, do one, teach one approach, which for some circumstances you'd never want to do. In MAID care, there was a small group of people localized in most of the centers across the country who rapidly became very educated in terms of the process, and we adopted shadowing techniques where people would come and spend time with us, learn a little bit about the assessments, learn a little bit about the provisions. And so it gradually evolved. We developed then local and regional best practices at different rates. So depending upon where you are in the country, there may have been the development of clinical programs or referral practices, et cetera, which involved various different specialists and patterns of referral and that sort of thing. Basically, what happened after that is a group called the Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers, or CAMAP, was created very early in the course of MAID in Canada to help support clinicians providing MAID-related care. And in 2021, CAMAP was approached by Canadian parliamentarians to develop and implement a national MAID educational curriculum because it became apparent that education around MAID for clinicians was happening in a sort of a haphazard way across the country. And that if we had a more organized approach, it would actually help make things better in multiple different ways. So CAMAP is actually involved in training workshops. They were doing educational workshops around how to do a MAID assessment, how to become involved in MAID provisions, complicated sort of scenarios, et cetera, but nothing that was standardized across the country. CAMAP is also involved in case sharing webinars. So people who do assessments and provisions would get together periodically and in a secure and private Zoom type environment, talk about actual cases and learn from each other. CAMAP also provides guidance documents in the same way that the Dying with Dignity Canada does. It has a community of practice. We have webinars and conferences and blogs and stuff, and also involved in research. But we really hadn't had much in terms of an educational platform that was standardized across the country. So at that time, Stephanie Green, who is the president of CAMAP, went through her Rolodex and made a few phone calls. If anybody is on the call who knows Stephanie, you'd know that it's very difficult to say no to her. So I got a call, and several of my friends did as well. And so several experienced MAID practitioners from across the land were approached to develop this MAID Curriculum Development Committee. And initially, one of the benefits, I suppose, of the pandemic was that we were getting much better at Zoom, even though there are good things and bad things about it. And we held Zoom meetings to develop a bit of a framework. And so this is the list of the core committee. Some of you joining in from across the country might recognize some of these people from across the country as being people that you have heard about or might be promoting and developing MAID activities in your area. At that time, we had mostly physicians. Andrew Froelich is a PhD from Ontario, and Willie Karenko is a nurse practitioner in Ontario. There were some adjustments made, and the committee shifted a little tiny bit. And through time, we ended up with 2 nurse practitioners in addition to the rest of us from across the country. So our vision was to produce high quality national recognized MAID training curriculum for assessors and providers in Canada. The program will be informed by and sensitive to and responsive to the needs of Indigenous, racialized, disabled, and marginalized Canadians. Our objectives were to establish and oversee interdisciplinary working groups that would develop the educational content of the project, and I'll talk a little bit about that, determine the training formats in both official languages, and to obtain accreditation from relevant national organizations. It's the Canadian Nursing Association, the Canadian Family Physician College, and the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. From an educational perspective, for those of you who aren't clinicians on the call, it's really important from an accrediting body to have their stamp of approval on these sorts of processes so that people who are taking these courses can basically back it up and say, this has been approved by my college and is an accredited activity and is of high quality. Also, we hoped through the development and implementation of the national curriculum that would increase access to high quality MAID training for interested healthcare providers across Canada. That's really our big focus, is to find people who are not yet involved in MAID work, but who might become interested and then have this training available to them. To advance the skills of existing practitioners, recognizing that you can always learn something about how to improve your craft. To encourage mentoring and train the trainer activities, and by doing that, to really start to develop local communities of practice across the country so that in Prince Edward Island or in Saskatchewan or in the Yukon, wherever you are practicing, you have people who you can go to for advice and for assistance. To educate new MAID practitioners, obviously, and then to develop a standardized approach to the assessments and provisions across the country, so that really we're all singing off the same song sheet when we're doing the work that we're going to do. So the modules, the educational modules themselves, we've got a number of them, and I'm just going to talk about each one very briefly. The first is a module looking at the foundations of MAID in Canada. So this is basically a historical look at MAID from prior to 2016 all the way up to introduction of C7, and then looking forward to what's going to happen down the road. A module specifically looking at clinical conversations about MAID. It's interesting because when MAID first came about, people quite quickly realized that it really is about asking questions and learning about a patient's history, about their medical history, getting a sense of what's going on with their healthcare at the present time, their thoughts about the future, how it is that they've come to consider a medically assisted death, etc. And there's a lot of nuance in those discussions, and most clinicians are very good at taking histories and acquiring information, but there's certain things that can be done better for everybody. So we've got a specific chapter looking at clinical conversations. There's a module on how to do a basic MAID assessment, so making sure that the patient or the person seeking medically assisted death has a proper assessment that's done in a compassionate and forthright manner, but at the same time as making sure that they meet all of the eligibility requirements. In terms of assessing patients, many people who are seeking to have a conversation about medical assistance in dying might be vulnerable in some way, either through their health or through their social or economic circumstances or what have you. And also sometimes there are questions about a person's capacity, their actual ability to make decisions about their health care. So we've got a module looking at assessing beyond just a basic assessment, these challenging areas of vulnerability and capacity. We've got an entire module looking at providing MAID. So what are the mechanics of the process itself, from preparing for the day, what happens on the day, what happens after the day, what are the things that patients and their supporters, families, persons with lived experience concerned about in these moments. We have a module looking at complex scenarios. As we've become familiar with MAID across the country, each assessor who's done an assessment and everyone who's done a provision has a handful of cases that were particularly challenging for one reason or another. Some of it is just the navigation of the entire process. Some of it is coming to an understanding about the degree of suffering. Some of it is about what happens on the day when something doesn't go well, and how do you deal with these complications. The mental health and MAID module is one that's of particular interest now because of what's going on with the upcoming legislation change in March of 2023. This module is presently in development as well, anticipating what will happen when the legislation and the final reports from the federal committees come down. We have a general sense of what's going to happen and have had close ties with the groups that are developing these reports, and also with the various different health regulatory bodies, the provincial colleges of physicians and nurse practitioners and such. So this is also in development. And then interestingly, we have a final module called Clinician Resilience and Reflection. And this was brought about because we recognized at the very beginning that MAID care and MAID work is very helpful and very rewarding to many people who do it, but also can be challenging. It has its own sets of things that can go wrong, things that can threaten your sense as a clinician about how you do your work and that sort of stuff, and sometimes can be just darned hard. And so we thought that rather than have a separate module on resilience and reflection, what we've actually done is we've incorporated the resilience and reflection module into each of the previous 7 modules. So as we're going through each module, there are parts where we will pause and reflect on what would happen if this happened. How does that actually make you feel as an assessor or provider? Are there things I can do to help in terms of my own interpretation of these experiences to make it better for me, and so that I can continue to do this really important work? So this is our overall organizational structure. So we've got the Canadian Association of Medical Assessors and Providers, or CAMAP, at the very top in blue. We've got our curriculum development project, and we have our 8 different working groups that I've just described to you. We also have a national steering committee, and it was important because we wanted to make sure that a number of different places from across the country, representing all sorts of different groups, had an input into our project to make sure that we were doing the right thing for Canadians. And so once again, Stephanie Green, the CAMAP chair, went through her Rolodex and made a few more calls, and we were able to get representation from all of these different organizations. And if you look through, you can see it's fairly wide-reaching and all very national, trying to include rural physicians, Indigenous nurses, the Canadian Medical Protective Association, amongst many different others across. And so we have regular meetings with these people. They vet our policy, they vet our process, they take a look at the modules and provide comments, and we're getting really, really good feedback from them as we're going forward. A process like this costs money. And so initially when we got together, we didn't really have a sense of what would be involved. But early on, we were invited to prepare a grant that was sent into Health Canada. So Stephanie Green, who I've mentioned, myself, Dr. Madeline Lee from Toronto is a MAID assessor and provider and has a strong research focus. And we had a grant writing expert named Greg, who was instrumental in helping us go through the politics and the process of writing a grant. So we developed a 4-year project involving curriculum development, implementation, and evaluation. We were funded by Health Canada for $3.3 million starting in September, and we have scheduled updates and deliverables with Health Canada, and regular meetings with them to make sure we're on track and on budget. In terms of the project funding, it helped to fund the project leads, so Dr. Green, Dr. Lee, and myself. We now have a project manager, we have a project coordinator who does administrative support. We also paid our working group activities, Zoom calls and national meetings, and paid a small stipend to our working group members to basically thank them for the work that they're doing. We were able to hire a project vendor. So these are the people at the educational unit at Queen's University who are pulling together and developing the actual modules themselves and making them very highly desirable and very sexy looking, so that we've got really, really good looking quality, and also a research component as well. So we realize that there will be a lot of good research that comes out of this project because it's unique in the world. So our organizational structure also includes Health Canada. We have project staff. I mentioned, so Sarah Stevens is our project manager, and Christine Huao is our project coordinator. They work virtually, meet with us on a regular basis. We've got a meeting this evening to go through the content of one of our modules and see where the next steps are. And then, as I've mentioned, we've got Queen's University who are involved in developing the actual forward-facing project, the actual modules, the storyboards, etc. So how the modules work, we've got core committee members chairing each of these 8 working groups. Each group has 5 to 7 people per group. So we've got about 50 or so people from across the country. We are doing our best to be nationally representative, to include people who are assessors, who are providers. We're sensitive to gender, urban-rural balance, people who have skills as nurse practitioners and physicians. We're also interested in equity, diversity, and inclusivity, and making sure that we're trying to represent those populations as best we can, and also representing the needs of persons with lived experience. So several of our modules, including the module I'm chairing on MAID assessments, we have the husband of a woman who actually had a MAID provision done here in Nova Scotia a couple of years ago, and these people are populated throughout the modules to give that assessment, that flavor. We also have persons with lived experience on our national steering group, and they're actually involved in evaluating the modules as we're developing them as well. So once again, here are the modules. In terms of how they're developed, each group got together and developed an outline. We then surveyed across the country and collected content because we recognized that a lot of the education was already ongoing, and rather than reinventing the wheel, we took some already established teaching courses and modules and basically broke them down into their components and collected what we required. That involved a lot of curation. We then, once we got a basic outline, sent it for stakeholder feedback to our different groups, as I've mentioned. Each of the other working groups had a look at it, our National Steering Committee. We also have through CAMAP a Provincial and Territorial Advisory Council, which is a physician and nurse practitioner from each province. And we sent it to the Provincial Territorial Group because we recognize that that MAID is provided differently in different parts of the country, and that there might be local flavor and nuance, which would be very important to capture if we're going to be teaching, so that things might be a bit different in Manitoba than they might be in Newfoundland and Labrador. We developed a draft module through Queen's, which has a storyboard. The storyboard was much more what the look and feel of the module would be. Some used clinical case scenarios with animations. Some have videos. Some have animated interactive components that the users can look at. Got feedback from those as well. Right now, we're in the final module and final storyboard phasing for all of the modules that were being developed. They're each being developed in a sequential process, and so some are a bit further ahead than others. At the end of the day, the Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers will apply a final approval for the modules. They're then accredited and translated, and then they'll be launched going forward. And the launch process has a couple of phases as well. So we're going to do a soft launch where we test it on focus groups of experienced clinicians, people who have not been involved before, people with lived experience, getting a sense of how the modules feel to make sure that we're really capturing what we ought to. And then finally, an ongoing process of evaluation, which will lead to research and publications. So the module development, as I mentioned, was overseen by educational experts at Queen's University. The modules will be available in English and in French, so everything is being translated. Several of the modules will be accessible online, so they're just an asynchronous module that a person who's interested in learning could go and take on their own in their own time in their living room with a nice cup of coffee. And others have a component which will be facilitated in person, so an actual workshop with a workshop leader and a group of people gathering together or virtually to experience the clinical content that way. Some of our modules will have both, so you'll have an asynchronous bit as homework to do before you do the synchronous module to consolidate the learning and to go through more specific examples. The modules, I hope I've suggested, will be rigorously implemented and research focused. We've got a whole evaluation process involving a variety of end user groups from across Canada. As I mentioned, they'll be accredited by our medical and nursing colleges, and then will eventually be promoted and disseminated and sustained with support from our National Steering Committee, because all of those groups across the country that I've mentioned have very much the finger on the pulse and a vested interest in making sure that their member groups are aware of this educational content and that it's available to them. So we have had, up to this point, since the funding began last year, we've had 2 stakeholder engagement meetings, one in May and one in October of this year. The module content is now essentially complete. We're in the process now of storyboarding the modules and turning them from a series of just data and information into these engageable, interactive modules and presentations. Our research and evaluation team is now meeting regularly. We've done a pre-launch survey to get a sense of what people are expecting when these things come out. Pre and post module evaluations are being drafted and underway for each module. And then we're planning for train the trainer workshops, because once the modules are completed, we'll need people who can actually facilitate them for people who are going to learn them. So our first one is in January of 2023 in Vancouver. And lucky me, I get to fly from Halifax to Vancouver to be involved in that one. We've had a bit of buy-in from around the world. So we've actually had 4 presentations to date at national and international conferences. One of them happened in Toronto. We had one in Belgium, and our most recent at the World Federation Right to Die Society's conference. Some people on this audience might have been there in November of this just past year. We also have a little bit of street credit going on. So this is a communication from the Minister of Health's office from October. It was put out in relation to some of the discussion that's going on with Parliament at the present time in terms of how MAID is being prepared, especially with relation to mental health. And it actually talks a little bit about the training process that we're actually engaged in. So if the Minister of Health says it's real, it must be real. We also have some information available online. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more, you can go to the CAMAP website, https://camapcanada.ca/curriculum/ and it'll take you to a basic description of all of the things that I've talked to you about. So my objectives were to understand a brief history of MAID education in Canada. It started off rather sporadically and has gradually evolved. We now have many people across the country who are very skilled at providing MAID education, and we're now gathering all of those people together to create the modules that were going to be uniquely Canadian, also involving resilience and clinician care, and focused to also include the opinions and values of persons with lived experience. And hopefully, if there's anybody on the call who is a clinician who would like to become involved, we could hear from you. My email address, ggubitz@dal.ca, if you have any thoughts or feelings or observations. And I believe that that is my last slide, so I will stop sharing my screen now. And I hope that wasn't too quick, but I wanted to leave lots of time for discussion in case people had questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gubitz. And Helen, thank you as well for both of your presentations. They were very informative, and I think it did a great job of summarizing where we are and what our focus is as we continue going forward. And it was great to learn a little bit more about the clinician's curriculum that's being developed right now. So thank you both so much. This concludes sort of the formal part of our presentations from both of our presenters today. We're now going to move it on to our audience Q&A. And I just want to say thank you to everybody that submitted their questions. There's been lots of discussion going on during the presentation, so thank you so much for your engagement on that. So Dr. Gubitz, I'm actually going to start with you. And our first question from our audience member asks, is the number of providers keeping pace with demand? And what barriers are people experiencing now with regards to MAID?
It's a fantastic question. We can always use more help. I think when MAID first started, I can speak for Nova Scotia specifically, but across the country, we're encountering similar challenges. Beg your pardon. When MAID first began, the number of requests was small, and it has gradually increased over time. And then recently, in March of last year, when persons whose death was not reasonably foreseeable, natural death was not reasonably foreseeable, that introduced a whole different group of people who were requesting assessments and such, and that's increased the requirement for people to do the work. We've had a number of early adopters, so people who were sort of on side with the whole concept of medical assistance in dying, and those people joined up. Our educational efforts continue going forward. And so we're always looking for people to help. There are probably, I know in Nova Scotia, we do have some wait lists and people are not being seen as quickly as they might want to. But we do have a triage process in our province where if the case is particularly urgent, we can get to them. Other people might have to wait a little bit. It's reflective of healthcare in general, I think. We could always use more help. One of the things that I hope to do going forward is that after we've got this national curriculum going forward, this is the perfect basis to develop curricula that would then go into medical schools and nursing schools so that we can start to teach young clinicians a little bit more about it. At Dalhousie University, where I work, I've done numerous training sessions with all sorts of different medical student groups and resident groups, and the younger graduates today are starting to think about this as a normal part of medical practice. A lot of, shall I say, more experienced clinicians who were never trained in this process, and it's sort of anathema for a lot of folks. I should not be involved in this because I was really put on the earth to make people well. And so breaking down some of those attitudes and barriers is a bit of a challenge. But I think it's getting better as society gradually comes to accept that MAID is here and it's here to stay, and it's being done well, and it's being done thoughtfully and with great consideration by the people who are doing it. So that's a long answer. I'm sorry.
No, we like long answers. We like thorough answers. And luckily, that's the one you gave. Helen, I wanted to switch it over to you as well, if there was anything else you wanted to add as well.
Yeah, I mean, certainly anecdotally, we're hearing across the country a number of the points that Gord made. So those are challenges. Forced transfers obviously are a big barrier. And then a couple other things just we don't always think about, but the administrative burden on clinicians, particularly around those track 2 or death not reasonably foreseeable individuals, and remuneration for nurse practitioners in some provinces is a big challenge. Ontario immediately comes to mind. So those types of areas. And then I think just the lack of awareness. So people maybe not knowing that MAID is an option for them, people not knowing that MAID exists at all. So just that foundational information and education that we're all doing all the time.
Absolutely. Thank you both. For our next question, and this is going to be directed to Dr. Gubitz. This audience member asks, do you have confidence that training materials related to MAID for the mentally ill will be able to be put in place in the short period between the release of the guidelines and the date of implementation?
No. Short answer this time. When the process for developing the training modules was put in place, it was done separately to the whole concept of March 2023. We've recognized that the need is there. We deliberately had to wait until we had more information before we could create a module. So as it happens with the module or with the basic report having been released, we have a sense of what it's going to look like. And also then we also have to think about what's going on at each provincial level in terms of how the provinces will develop standards around that, reflecting their colleges. So the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Nova Scotia, all the other provinces and territories will have the rules in terms of what clinicians are ought to do. So those will need to develop in sync as well. So I think knowing that the majority of people who will be requesting MAID for mental health as a sole underlying condition would be track 2 type patients whose natural death is not reasonably foreseeable, built into that is a 90-day period of assessment and referral and evaluation. So I think we'll have to sort of go step by step and see how it gets implemented across the country. The other thing as well is that each province and territory is approaching this in a slightly different way, right? So some places have committees established to start to work at this. Others are a little bit further advanced, a little less advanced. So there will be some catch up, but I think that there's enough emphasis on the importance of the issue that people won't be left saying, where did this come from? Because everybody's quite aware that it's coming down the pipes.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Gubitz. For our next question, I'm going to direct this over to Helen. And this audience member asks, is there anything that I can do to prepare ahead for the new eligibility of MAID and mental illness requests?
I think that's actually a question for Gord. I know we get a number of inquiries from people asking. I mean, the reality is we don't know exactly what will be required and what the guidelines will be in any province or territory. I think it's always generally good information. Whatever you can collect in terms of medical records and history and files, that information is important. And then, Gord, maybe anything you would add from a clinical perspective to that question?
Yeah, so I think the important thing to recognize is that from a practical perspective, what a lot of us are trying to get our heads around is that people with mental health issues who are asking about MAID or considering making a request are similar to many other people with conditions in which their natural death is not reasonably foreseeable. Chronic pain patients, patients with high spinal cord injuries who are otherwise stable, those are the sorts of people who are asking us questions right now. We need to go through a very rigorous process. The track 2 criteria apply. So you have to have 2 assessments by individuals. One of them will have to have expertise in the condition. In Nova Scotia, as an example, one of the things that we're discussing is whether one of those people must be a psychiatrist, because it makes sense that in that sort of circumstance, a psychiatrist would have the expertise. And we know that when a lot of psychiatrists are assessing patients, the diagnostic formulations that they come up with involve a lot of research around the patient. So we've got to go through a lot of detail. We've got to talk to perhaps a psychologist to do detailed assessments. We've got to get through their past history, which is sometimes quite extensive. And then taking a look at the treatments that have been provided. Are there other treatments that haven't been indicated or haven't been assessed or tried yet? That sort of stuff. So it's going to be really laborious, I think, for each of these assessments. But I think that the government and the way that it's developed the track 2 process has done that on purpose, because people really do need to make sure that this is the right thing for them. And we have to follow the law. Right.
Absolutely. And thank you so much to both Helen and Dr. Gubitz as well. For our next question, this audience member asks, When receiving a diagnosis for an incurable illness, can you receive MAID even if you choose to refuse the treatment options available to alleviate one's symptoms? And I think we'll, of course, lean on the clinician here and ask Dr. Gubitz.
Sure. So I'm going to perhaps focus that on more medical as opposed to mental health, because it's a little bit easier that way, and some of the mental health stuff is to be determined. So if a person has received a diagnosis of an incurable illness, for example, a cancer that has grown and moved or metastasized to other places in the body, so there's cancer in multiple different places, there might be a number of different options that are available to them when they speak to their cancer specialist or a radiation oncologist, a medical oncologist. Those options come with risks and benefits, and it's up to the discussion with the patient to determine whether or not that would be appropriate. So, for example, I might see a person who has had a cancer diagnosis and they've undergone a surgery to help to remove the cancer. They've had some chemotherapy. The cancer has returned, and they've been told that other options are available. The odds of curing your cancer now are X percent, 20%, 10%, but the risks of causing unwanted side effects, nausea, vomiting, weight loss, all those sorts of things are quite high. There's a calculus that goes on, and eventually a patient can decide, I don't think that's for me. And I think, although I know that's an option for me, it's not something I want to do. All right. But we have to identify as the person's been given the option, that they understand the pros, the cons, and then they can make their own decision. So people do not have to do everything that's on the list. Right. And I think it's important to understand that a person's degree of suffering has to come into this as well. And it eventually becomes a balance between all of those things. So ultimately, in the maritime sort of tradition, the patient is the captain of this ship, right? And they're steering it where they want it to go, and we're there to try and support them and make sure they have enough information to make the right decision for themselves.
Thank you. And I love that analogy. For our next question, we're going to direct this towards Helen. One of our audience members wants to ask a little bit about the upcoming changes for 2023. And this audience member asks, how likely is it that politicians or members of the media will be able to stop the changes in eligibility that are coming in 2023?
Yeah, that's a tough question, and I'm sure, what I'm going to say is probably not what everyone wants to hear. So the reality is the politicians are the only ones who can change that, but certainly the media can influence it. And I think given what we're currently seeing in the media, including a recent article that indicated that all parties would support a pause potentially if they were asked, I do think there is a possibility that date may change. I think that the right work is being done. I think that, we've been down this road before with both C14 and C7, and I think our clinicians are a conscientious, careful, thoughtful group. So I think they can do the work. That said, it's not always totally within our control. So, I would reiterate something I said earlier. If this is an issue that's important to you, if you want to do what you can to make sure that date doesn't slip, talk to your MP, send a letter to your MP. We've got the letter writing tool up on our website, and we'll share that in our follow-up email after the webinar. But, I would like to say there's no possibility. Given everything that's going on, I can't, in fairness, say that. So we're concerned. We've already commented publicly our position around that, and we'll continue to do so.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Helen. I know it's not always the best of news that we hear, but I think it's essential to always stay informed. So for this next question, this is for Dr. Gord Gubitz. This audience member asks, how is the patient perspective or patient's input being incorporated into the modules that are being developed currently?
Great. So as I mentioned in the slide show that I gave, we are very interested in the opinions, the voice of the persons with lived experience. It has been challenging sort of technically to have actual patients involved in the committees because often they're not well. And so what we've gone to do is we've looked at several different national organizations. Bridge C14 is an example of one that you may have heard of. And they have representatives on our national steering committee. So anytime we have a presentation to them, like the presentation I've given, we talk about that, we get their input, we get their response. There is a national group of persons with lived experience who's been identified who will be involved in reviewing the modules themselves to get a sense that they ring true, that there isn't anything there that is been glossed over or is disrespectful or what have you. And we've tried as much as we can for individual modules that we're developing to include a person with lived experience in the module itself for that same purpose, just to make sure that a group of medical doctors and nurse practitioners who don't know what they're talking about clearly have missed this point, which we sometimes hear. You say you've gone off in left field and gone all medical on us, and we really need this to be explained in a way that's a bit more public friendly, as an example. So we're getting a lot of good feedback, and we'll continue to look for that.
Thank you. And this next question actually follows along with more concerns about the curriculum as well. So this audience member asks, will there be an opportunity for members that are not, or individuals that are not members of CAMAP to access any of the modules you've described today?
Oh, yes. Yeah. The whole process, or the whole point of this, is so that we can allow the education to be provided to as many medical doctors and nurse practitioners across the country as possible. So we're actually targeting non-CAMAP members. Hopefully, once they become involved in the process, they might say, gosh, maybe I should join CAMAP. It's not terribly expensive, because then you get the added support of people involved in the work, developing a community of practice in your own area. For people who work in small communities, being the only person who's doing medical assistance and dying work can be a bit isolating, because small communities being what they are, right? So if you knew somebody in another small community just a little bit away, you develop a resource network and support. So we are really targeting non-CAMAP members to become involved. That's the whole point.
Thank you so much. For this next question, once again asking about the curriculum, this audience member notes that the list of practitioners that was featured on one of your slides that are working on the curriculum don't feature practitioners from some regions. They list here from Alberta or from Saskatchewan or Manitoba, and they wanted to know if there's a reason for this.
Right. So the working group chairs, those 8 or 9 people that we listed, were handpicked by CAMAP because of our expertise in particular areas. And it just happens, population base, a lot of people live in BC, Alberta, Ontario. And so that's the way that worked. What we've done, though, is for each of the working groups that each of those persons chairs. So I have a working group. We're doing the MAID assessment working group. I've got 7 people from across the country. And so we've come at it that way. So we've got people in each of the working groups, 5 to 7 people, and we are nationally represented in that way. We also, in terms of other national representation, have our provincial territorial advisory committee that has people from each province and territory who see the work and comment on it. And then our national steering committee, national in scope, with national members. And so there's a lot of people who are going to have eyes on this work before it's finally published. The feedback, oh my goodness, you should see pages and pages and pages of feedback. And so we're taking it all in and we're incorporating it, and some of it's lovely and some of it's ridiculous. And so we're dealing with it as best we can.
I can't say that I envy your position. I'm grateful for the work from CAMAP, but I can't say that I'd like to trade places.
It's fun. It's really fun.
I'll have to agree to disagree there. For our next question, this is also on the MAID curriculum. Lots and lots of questions on the MAID curriculum, so you've definitely sparked interest. This audience member asks, will the accredited MAID curriculum become mandatory for all clinicians?
The intention is that it not become mandatory, because there isn't anything in the law that compels clinicians to become involved in MAID work. In the same way, we wouldn't compel people to take to pass an exam in order to do this, because any clinician practicing in the country right now, medical doctor, nurse practitioner can already become involved in this work. The purpose of this work is to provide people with tools that will allow them to do it better, and it might help people who are a little bit, I don't know if I'd like to do this, to educate themselves and say, oh, I could do this. This is important to me, and I'd like to learn the skills. So the accreditation is important. So making sure that the national bodies that govern our training look at this and say, this is a high quality teaching curriculum, and we're going to give it our stamp of approval, so that it has that the merit and the gravitas that it needs to become acceptable.
Thank you. For this next question, we've talked in your presentation about clinicians being physicians or nurse practitioners being the locus for quite a lot of this curriculum. But this audience member wants to ask about if there is space for other members of the healthcare community, such as social workers, being offered the opportunity to weigh in. And if you could speak to that as well.
Sure. Because the curriculum is very, very wide-reaching, I can imagine it would be very easy for people who are interested to come and learn on the module about the background, for example, the module about difficult clinical conversations. All of those things could be very helpful for anybody who's involved in aspects of healthcare, even outside of MAID, right? So having better communication skills, really good for people in general. Some of the modules are really specific and so might not be relevant to folk, but we're mindful of that. And we know as well, as an example, we've got in several jurisdictions around the country, we've got care coordinators who are involved in managing teams of people, assessing people, doing referrals, all that sort of stuff. And so it makes sense that those people would be able to see the modules, have a look through them, because it's some of the work that they're providing information on. So our hope is not to be restrictive, but to sort of pick the pieces that would be most useful.
Thank you. Fantastic. And for the final question, sort of related to curriculum development, this audience member wants to ask, is there any formal participation in the curriculum development from groups for persons with disabilities, for example?
They were offered participation in the national on the National Steering Committee, and a number of groups looked at it and said, not for us at the present time, but we do reach out to folk, and we are keeping them apprised and involved as best we can. But a lot of it is it's challenging work for a lot of groups, right? And it rubs very close to home, and especially when you're thinking about track 2 patients who might fall a little bit more into those categories of people with longstanding challenges and disabilities. So we're sensitive to it. But we haven't had that direct conversation yet. We're hopeful that it will continue to move forward.
Thank you so much. So we're going to move on to a different subject now for these 2 audience questions. And the topic for both of these is going to be advanced care planning and advanced care directives. And we'll start with you, Dr. Gubitz, but Helen, of course, feel free to jump in to add anything further. But this audience member asks, what do I need to communicate to my doctor about my wishes and my advanced care directive?
So I guess, first of all, I would agree with Helen in her initial presentation. It's very important that everybody has some sort of advanced care plan, end-of-life plan developed, even if it's at its most rudimentary. So assigning someone to be a power of attorney or a surrogate decision maker in case suddenly you're not able to make your own decisions. Practically speaking, in the work I do every day, my heart sinks when I've got no one to communicate with and this person has a big problem, right? So that's important. I think it's important to sit down with yourself and also with people who are involved in your decision making, cared ones, spouses, partners, whomever, and get a sense of what's really valuable to you. What do you want to have happen to you if you become unwell? Do you want to go to an intensive care unit? Do you want to have resuscitation? Do you want to have a feeding tube in the event, that your healthcare problem cannot be cured, or if it can be, right? So under these circumstances, under other circumstances, and I know that Dying with Dignity has a lot of resources available on that, and so educating yourself through the available resources, sitting down, putting something together, and then bringing it to your family doctor and saying, here's what I've come up with. Does this seem reasonable? Have I missed anything? Because sometimes you don't think about this, you don't think about that. And then at the end, making sure that document is available, that it's been properly put on paper so that it's not scratched on a piece of terry towel from the kitchen and, subject to dissolving in water. Stuff. I've seen that. Somebody came in with an advance directive on a piece of paper towel, and I thought, I'm not sure if this is really real, but it's important, right? And Helen, you can speak more eloquently to this than I can. What have I missed?
No, I mean, I think that that's important. The other thing I would reiterate is, again, just that having the conversation with your family. We hear all the time from people, and I'm sure many of us have personal experience of, oh, well, mom would have wanted. But in the moment, if you haven't talked about, you won't really know what mom wanted. And it can be a really hard time for families. It's an already stressful, sad time. You don't need to exasperate that by not really knowing what you want to do. So, again, we would just encourage people. There are provincial forms available. The rules are a little different in every province. So refer to the guide that we have online and the appropriate forms. And then, run it by your clinician and run it by your family members and just try to get everyone on the same page.
And then the final thing is to make sure that that their family knows where the copy of the form is.
Yes.
Right? So a lot of people will have those folders, those little green sleeves that they keep in the fridge or on a counter, or say it's always there. So when the paramedics come to the house, they say, the form, it's in the fridge.
Yeah, we also provide, as part of the kit, you can add a little wallet card so that an extra way to alert people to the fact that you do have information available. But that's a great comment. The fridge is always a good spot to keep a note about your advanced care plan.
Absolutely. And just a reminder to everybody that we have our kit available on the website or available by mail upon request. So please check that out and make sure to fill out your advanced care plan if you haven't already. And this final question on advanced care directives, and I'll let either one of you jump in. This audience member asks, are advanced care directives best completed alongside a family physician or even a lawyer?
So I think, Helen, as you said, it would depend upon the jurisdiction.
Yeah, there's no actual requirement to engage a lawyer. Certainly, I think with all things, there are people who feel more comforted having a lawyer involved, and that's certainly something you can do. There's not actually a requirement. I think, what Gord said earlier about getting it prepared and then going to your family doctor or nurse practitioner just to do a run through in case you've missed something is probably the best advice. But you should start the work first. Kind of think about what you want, and the guide really walks you through thinking about what's important to you. What does quality of life look like? What scenarios do you want to avoid or not avoid? So you've got a good foundation for kind of preparing and then talking to that healthcare provider.
Absolutely. And Dr. Gubitz, anything to add or?
No, that's perfect. How can I disagree with Helen? That just doesn't happen.
I haven't done it yet. I haven't tried it. All right. For our next question, this is actually directed towards Helen. And this audience member asks, does DWDC have any statistics as to how many publicly funded healthcare facilities, be they hospitals or hospices, that are causing these forced transfers, and how frequently do forced transfers occur?
Yeah, so the short answer to that question is no. That information is not readily available to us in as much detail as we would like, or for all facilities. So, we're working on putting together a bit of a database so that we can identify where the problems most exist. We do hear from people, so we are able to track, based on experiences, what we're hearing. But that is not something that is as easily available as we would like to see it. There's also, just so people know, there's also no obligation for facilities to disclose whether they will allow MAID on site or require a first transfer. So, unfortunately, one of the situations that we often hear about is someone ends up in a facility where at the time they arrive, maybe MAID isn't on their minds. And later in their journey, they determine that they'd like to go ahead with MAID. And it's only then that they sometimes find out that that's not an option. And that can be quite traumatic and difficult for people. So, so that's why we're looking to try and change those rules.
Absolutely. Thank you, Helen. All right, so this is our final question. We have so many more on our list, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So for this last one, Dr. Gubitz, this audience member asks, can you outline which types of mental health conditions might make someone eligible for MAID in 2023 when the eligibility expands?
Right. So that's a great question. I think a lot of people are thinking about that. Once again, I always revert back to the idea that people with mental health with sole underlying condition need to meet all the other criteria, right? So it has to be a grievous and irremediable healthcare problem. They have to be in an advanced state of decline. It has to be causing them suffering that can't be relieved in ways they consider acceptable. They have to have capacity to make those decisions, all that sort of stuff. In terms of the way it's been sort of organized and looked at in other jurisdictions, so in some of the countries in Europe, for example, where mental health as a sole underlying condition is an eligibility criteria, a lot of people with advanced types of depression that have been tried with multiple different treatment modalities, medications, electroconvulsive therapy, behavioral cognitive therapies and stuff, who it just doesn't work, and it's been going on for years and years. Some people with bipolar disorder, personality disorders, those are the ones that tend to be requesting more often. But we'll have to see. It'll be interesting to see what sorts of requests come forth as we go forward. But those would be the ones that come immediately to my mind. But I'm not a psychiatrist.
Good disclaimer. Good disclaimer. Thank you so much. This concludes our webinar for today. I want to thank Dr. Gubitz for joining us, and of course our CEO Helen Long. And I want to thank you, our audience members. Thank you so much for tuning in today and for tuning in all of this year. We certainly appreciate your support, and we couldn't do it without you. I want to wish everybody here from on behalf of all of us here at DWDC, happy holidays and a happy new year, and that I wish everybody the best of times and best of luck for next year. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you in the next webinar next year. Thank you so much, and goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.